Hi everyone. Tonight we're diving into a realm where the past is not just history, but a sensory experience, one that might make you wrinkle your nose, even across centuries. Imagine standing in the bustling heart of Elizabethan London, the air thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, animal waste, wood smoke, and something else, something uniquely, powerfully human. You can almost feel the grime clinging to your clothes, the damp chill seeping into your bones, and the ever-present, overwhelming odor of a world utterly unlike our own. You probably won't survive this level of historical immersion without a good sense of humor and perhaps a strong constitution. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And as you settle in, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, turn off the lights. Maybe turn on the fan to some soothing background music. And let's get started tonight. The royal scent of power. Elizabeth I's personal regimen. In the hallowed, often dimly lit chambers of Whitehall Palace, long before the first rays of the English sun had fully pierced the perpetual dampness of London, a very particular drama unfolded each morning. This was not a drama of political intrigue or courtly love, but one far more intimate, far more human, and arguably far more malodorous. This was the ritual of Queen Elizabeth I's personal hygiene, a practice so far removed from our modern sensibilities that it requires a deliberate mental adjustment to truly comprehend its nuances, its challenges, and its stark realities. Forget the romanticized images of a pristine monarch. The truth, as it so often is with history, is far more earthy. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the formidable ruler who guided England through one of its most pivotal periods, operated within a framework of hygiene that would, to us, seem almost incomprehensibly basic. The concept of daily bathing, as we understand it, simply did not exist for most people, even those at the pinnacle of society. Water was a precious commodity, difficult to heat and transport, and the prevailing medical theories of the time often viewed excessive washing with suspicion, believing that open pores made one more susceptible to disease. The air, it was thought, carried noxious humors and pestilences, and an overly clean body might inadvertently invite them in. This was not merely an oversight, it was a deeply ingrained cultural and medical belief system that dictated the rhythms of cleanliness, or rather, the lack thereof. For Elizabeth, her morning began not with a refreshing shower, but with a complex series of ablutions that prioritized surface cleanliness and the application of fragrant disguises over deep cleansing. Her maids of honor, trusted and meticulously selected, would attend to her. The first order of business would typically involve a basin of water, often scented with rosewater or other floral infusions, brought to her. This water, it is crucial to understand, was not for immersion. Instead, it was for a series of superficial washes. Her face and hands would be wiped down with cloths, removing the superficial dust and grime of the night. The concept of soap, while existing, was a coarse, often harsh substance, and not something to be liberally applied to delicate skin, particularly a monarch's. Instead, fine cloths, sometimes rubbed with mild emollients, or even dry, would suffice for the more sensitive areas. The meticulous grooming of her hair was another intricate affair. Elizabeth, renowned for her fiery red hair, though later in life, wigs became increasingly prevalent, would have her locks brushed and styled, often with the aid of scented powders. These powders, made from ingredients like orris root or other aromatic botanicals, served a dual purpose. They helped to absorb oils and provide a semblance of freshness, and perhaps more importantly, they masked any lingering odors. Hair washing, if it occurred at all, was an exceedingly rare event, perhaps once every few weeks or even months, depending on the season and the queen's schedule. Imagine the accumulated oils, the dust, the residual scents, all woven into the elaborate coiffures that defined her regal image. It's a testament to the power of appearance over reality. Her clothing, too, played a crucial role in her personal presentation. While the queen herself might not undergo a full bodily wash every day, her garments, particularly her outer layers, were designed to impress. Layers of rich fabrics, silks, velvets, brocades would be carefully selected and laid out. Underneath these opulent exteriors, however, the story was subtly different. Linen shifts, or smocks, were worn directly against the skin. These linen garments, easily laundered though still a laborious process of boiling and beating, acted as a crucial barrier, absorbing sweat, oils, and dead skin cells. They were the true workhorses of Elizabethan hygiene, changed perhaps every few days, offering a degree of freshness that the outer garments, with their infrequent cleaning, could not. The elaborate gowns, often stiff with embroidery and jewels, were not easily washed and would instead be aired out, brushed, and perhaps lightly scented to mitigate any unpleasantries. The queen's teeth, a notorious aspect of her later life, were another area where modern sensibilities clash sharply with historical practice. Sugar, a luxury imported from the New World, had become increasingly popular among the elite, and Elizabeth, like many of her contemporaries, developed a fondness for sweet treats. The devastating consequence was widespread dental decay, without the benefit of modern dentistry, or even regular brushing as we know it. Her teeth began to blacken and rot, causing her considerable pain and impacting her speech. While she might rinse her mouth with a concoction of wine or herbs, and perhaps rub her gums with a cloth, the concept of a toothbrush was still centuries away from widespread adoption. Her infamous blackened teeth became a visible marker of both her wealth and the limitations of Elizabethan medical knowledge. It is easy to recoil from these descriptions, to imagine the pervasive stench, the visible signs of a lack of thorough cleanliness, but it is vital to remember the context. This was not a period of ignorance. It was a period operating under different paradigms. The world was a much dirtier place by necessity. Roads were unpaved, animals roamed freely, and sewage systems were rudimentary at best. The very air was often heavy with the effluvia of human and animal life. In such an environment, the focus shifted from eradication of odor to its management and disguise. Perfumes, pomanders, small scented balls carried to ward off bad smells, and elaborate clothing were not merely aesthetic choices. They were practical tools for navigating a world that constantly assailed the senses. The queen, despite her status, was not immune to these realities. Her privileged position afforded her access to the finest imported soaps, the most exquisite perfumes, and the most dedicated attendants. But even these resources were limited by the scientific understanding and technological capabilities of the era. Her cleanliness was a performance, a careful curation of appearance, designed to project power and refinement, even as the biological realities of human existence asserted themselves beneath the lavish silks and stiff ruffs. So, as we consider Elizabeth's morning ritual, we must ask ourselves what unseen pressures, what unspoken expectations truly dictated the delicate balance between the royal scent of power and the undeniable realities of a pre-modern world. If the morning rituals of Queen Elizabeth I offered a glimpse into the superficial efforts to maintain a degree of presentability, the deeper question of bathing true immersion in water reveals even more about the prevailing attitudes towards cleanliness in Tudor England. For many, including royalty, bathing was not a daily or even weekly affair, but a much rarer, almost medicinal event, undertaken with considerable logistical effort and often with specific intentions beyond mere sanitation. The very idea of cleanliness was fluid, less about germ theory, which was centuries away, and more about the balance of humors, the appearance of propriety, and the strategic deployment of scent. For Elizabeth, a full bath was a significant undertaking. It required a portable wooden or copper tub, often lined with linen, to be brought into her chambers. Servants would then laboriously haul buckets of hot and cold water to fill it. This was no quick dip. The entire process was time-consuming, resource-intensive, and physically demanding for her staff. Consequently, records suggest that the Queen bathed perhaps once a month, or even less frequently, depending on the season, her health, and her travel schedule. This infrequency was not unusual. Many of her European counterparts adhered to similar, if not even more infrequent, bathing habits. King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, for instance, was famously reported to have a profound aversion to water, rarely bathing at all. When Elizabeth did bathe, it was often with specific additions to the water. Herbs, flowers, and essential oils were commonly used, not just for their pleasant aroma, but for their perceived medicinal properties. Rose petals, lavender, rosemary, and chamomile might be steeped in the water, believed to soothe the skin, calm the nerves, or even ward off illness. These were not luxury additions in the modern sense. They were practical components of a holistic approach to health and well-being that blended hygiene with herbal medicine. The goal was less about scrubbing away dirt and more about invigorating the senses, promoting good humors, and leaving a lingering, pleasant scent. This reliance on fragrance extended far beyond the bath. Perfumes and pomanders were indispensable tools in the Elizabethan olfactory landscape. Musk, ambergris, civet, and various floral essences were highly prized, often imported at great expense. These were not applied subtly. They were meant to be potent, assertive, capable of cutting through the ubiquitous background odors of sewage, unwashed bodies, stale food, and animal waste that permeated every aspect of Tudor life. Elizabeth herself was known to favor rich, heavy scents, and her chambers would have been constantly scented with a variety of strong perfumes, designed to both please her nose and, more importantly, to create an aura of cleanliness and sophistication. Pomanders, those small, often intricately decorated, hollow balls filled with aromatic substances, were a common sight. Carried by hand or hung from belts, they served as personal air purifiers, offering a direct, concentrated source of pleasant smell that could be brought to the nose at a moment's notice. For the elite, these were often exquisite works of art, crafted from silver or gold, reflecting the status of their owner even as they performed a vital function. The use of such devices highlights a fundamental difference in perception. Cleanliness was often equated with pleasant smell, rather than the absence of dirt itself. If something smelled good, it was considered clean, or at least its uncleanliness was successfully masked. Beyond personal hygiene, the broader politics of cleanliness played out in the daily life of the court and the kingdom. Royal progresses, the queen's journeys throughout her realm, presented unique challenges. The logistics of moving an entire court, including kitchens, laundries, and staff, meant that maintaining even the established standards of hygiene became incredibly difficult. When the queen and her retinue arrived at a nobleman's estate, considerable effort would be expended to ensure the premises were as clean as possible, often involving sweeping, airing out rooms, and burning aromatic herbs to purify the air. This was not just for comfort, it was a matter of respect and a demonstration of the host's loyalty and capability. The perception of cleanliness also extended to public health, albeit through a lens very different from our own. While the concept of infectious disease was poorly understood, the idea of bad air or miasmas causing illness was prevalent. Draining swamps, burning strong-smelling substances, and maintaining some degree of order in city streets, however rudimentary, were all efforts to combat these perceived airborne threats. However, without a grasp of microbiology, these efforts were often inadequate against widespread diseases like plague and smallpox, which frequently swept through Elizabethan England. The Queen herself survived several brushes with disease, most notably smallpox, which left her with facial scarring she meticulously covered with cosmetics. The Tudor court, therefore, was a sensory paradox, a place of immense beauty and opulence, adorned with rich tapestries, intricate carvings, and dazzling jewels, yet also a place where the pervasive realities of pre-modern hygiene were inescapable. The scent of wood smoke, stable animals, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present effluvia from rudimentary sanitation would have mingled with the heavy perfumes and the lingering aroma of rich food. For Elizabeth, navigating this world meant a constant performance of power, a careful balancing act between the expectations of her station and the limitations of her era. Her personal regimen was a testament to ingenuity and adaptation, a method of existing in a world where true cleanliness was an elusive ideal. Considering the intricate interplay of social expectation, limited resources, and evolving scientific understanding, what were the long-term implications of these deeply ingrained hygiene practices on the overall health and daily lives of the English populace? And how did they ultimately shape the very fabric of Tudor society? The story of Elizabeth Brewster's personal hygiene is more than just a collection of curious historical anecdotes. It's a window into the broader social, medical, and even political landscape of Tudor England. Her regimen, seemingly rudimentary by modern standards, was in fact a sophisticated adaptation to the prevailing conditions and knowledge of her era. The enduring legacy of her cleanliness, or more accurately, her management of presentation in a less than sanitary world, shaped perceptions of royalty, influenced public health discourse, and offers profound insights into human resilience and adaptation in the face of environmental challenges. Elizabeth's meticulous attention to her appearance, even if it involved masking rather than eliminating odors, reinforced the idea of a divinely ordained monarch. Her elaborate gowns, carefully styled wigs, and artfully applied cosmetics were not merely fashion statements. They were visual manifestations of her authority and her separation from the common populace. In a society where disease was often attributed to divine displeasure or moral failing, the ability to project an image of health and vitality, even if behind a facade of lead paint and strong perfumes, was crucial for maintaining public confidence. If the queen appeared unblemished and fragrant, it suggested a certain favor from God, a sense of order in a chaotic world. Her famous aversion to bathing after a certain age, possibly due to sensitivity from her smallpox scars, or simply a deeply ingrained cultural habit, meant that her reliance on superficial measures became even more pronounced. Yet her regal bearing remained unquestioned. The practices surrounding royal hygiene also inadvertently influenced the nascent understanding of public health. While germ theory was far off, the prevailing miasma theory, the belief that disease was caused by bad air or noxious fumes emanating from decaying matter, led to some practices that, by chance, had minor beneficial effects. The burning of aromatic herbs, the airing out of rooms, and even rudimentary attempts at waste management in royal residences, though driven by a desire to dispel unpleasant smells, contributed to a slightly less disease-ridden environment, at least for the elite. These efforts, though imperfect, underscored a growing awareness that environment and health were intrinsically linked, even if the precise mechanisms were misunderstood. The vast disparities in hygiene between the royal court and the common people, who lived in far more squalid conditions, starkly highlighted the correlation between wealth, access to resources like clean linen and fresh water, and overall health outcomes. The urban poor, living amidst open sewers and rampant waste, were perpetually vulnerable to epidemics that spared few. Elizabeth's personal story of managing her dental decay also provides a poignant illustration of human endurance and the limitations of medical science. Her blackened teeth, a clear sign of the era's widespread issue with sugar consumption and lack of oral hygiene, were a private agony that became a public talking point. Yet, she persevered, speaking and governing with what must have been considerable discomfort. This resilience, a common thread throughout the lives of ordinary people as well, speaks to the immense capacity of humans to adapt to physical pain and discomfort when there is no other option. It reminds us that historical figures were not immune to the mundane struggles of the body, and that their triumphs were often achieved despite, rather than because of, the physical conditions of their time. Perhaps the most profound impact of Elizabethan hygiene practices, both royal and common, lies in what it tells us about the human relationship with the body and its environment. In an age without widespread plumbing, disinfectants, or a scientific understanding of microbes, people developed ingenious, if often unappealing, methods for coping with the realities of human biology. They relied on layers of clothing, the strategic use of strong scents, and a deep-seated acceptance of pervasive odors as a part of daily life. This was not a moral failing, it was a practical reality. Our modern aversion to these historical practices often stems from our own advancements, making it easy to judge. But to truly understand We must shed these preconceptions and recognize the ingenuity in survival. Elizabeth's personal hygiene, therefore, was not merely a quirky historical detail, it was a microcosm of Tudor society's challenges and adaptations, reflecting its medical understanding, social hierarchies, technological limitations, and enduring human spirit. Her ability to rule a powerful nation while navigating such fundamental bodily realities speaks volumes about her character and the era she inhabited. It forces us to reconsider our own assumptions about cleanliness and comfort, and to appreciate how far we have come, built on the foundations of a past that, however stinky, was undeniably rich with human experience. Unseen Filth, the daily grime of Elizabethan London, having explored the personal attempts at cleanliness, or rather, the careful management of odors, within the hallowed halls of Elizabeth I's palaces, we now step out into the very streets that surrounded these opulent residences. If the royal chambers presented a carefully curated, if still challenging, olfactory experience, the wider city of London offered a visceral assault on the senses, a swirling miasma of sights, sounds, and above all, smells that would test the fortitude of even the most seasoned modern traveler. This was the true underbelly of Elizabethan grandeur, a sprawling metropolis grappling with the fundamental, messy realities of human existence on an unprecedented scale, without the benefit of organized sanitation or a scientific understanding of disease. Imagine yourself, if you will, walking through the narrow, winding lanes of London in the late 16th century. The cobblestones beneath your feet are perpetually damp, slick with a cocktail of rainwater, spilled ale, and something far more unsavory. Overhead, the timber-framed buildings lean precariously, almost touching, creating dark, sunless passages where the air hangs heavy and still. The sounds are a cacophony, the clang of blacksmiths, the hawking cries of street vendors, the rattle of cartwheels, and the constant murmur of thousands of voices, but it is the smell that truly dominates, a pervasive, layered aroma that defies easy description. It is the scent of wood smoke from countless hearths, mingling with the sharp tang of human and animal waste. It is the sickly sweet odor of decaying refuse, the musky dampness of unwashed bodies, the sourness of brewing and tanning, and the metallic scent of fresh blood from slaughterhouses within the city walls. This was not a city to be merely seen. It was a city to be experienced with every fiber of your being, particularly your nose. At the heart of London's daily grime was the fundamental problem of waste management, with a population swelling to over 100,000. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, an enormous number for the time, the sheer volume of human and animal waste generated each day was staggering. There were no municipal sewage systems as we know them. Instead, most houses, even those of the relatively affluent, relied on privies, essentially deep pits or cesspools dug beneath the property. These pits would collect human excrement, slowly filling up over time. When full, the unenviable task of emptying them fell to a specialized and deeply unpopular profession, the gong farmers. These individuals, often working only at night to avoid the worst of the stench and public scrutiny, would shovel the accumulated waste into carts and transport it, usually to designated dumping grounds outside the city walls, or sometimes, tragically, directly into the nearest river. The The process was slow, inefficient, and profoundly polluting. The streets themselves served as an informal, unregulated dumping ground for all manner of refuse, household waste, food scraps, offal from butchers, and even the waste from small workshops and industries were routinely tossed directly into the gutters that ran down the middle or sides of the thoroughfares. Animals, primarily pigs and chickens, roamed freely in some areas, acting as informal scavengers. Though their presence added to the overall filth, dogs, too, contributed to the pervasive mess. Rain, when it fell, would wash some of this detritus into the Thames, transforming the river, the city's lifeblood and primary transport artery, into an open sewer. This meant that the same river from which many Londoners drew their drinking water was also the repository for their waste, a chilling irony with deadly consequences. The impact of such rudimentary sanitation on public health was catastrophic. Disease was not an occasional occurrence, but a constant, looming threat. Bubonic plague, smallpox, typhus, dysentery, and influenza were endemic, regularly sweeping through the population in terrifying epidemics that could decimate entire families and neighborhoods. Without any understanding of germ theory, the connection between filth and sickness was poorly understood. While some physicians clung to the ancient Greek theory of miasmas, believing that bad air caused disease, others attributed illness to imbalanced humors within the body, to divine punishment, or even to astrological alignments. Cleanliness, if considered at all, was more about aesthetic appeal or superficial religious purity than preventing microscopic pathogens. This lack of scientific understanding meant that responses to outbreaks were often ineffective or even counterproductive. During plague epidemics, for instance, efforts might focus on quarantining infected households by painting a red cross on their door and locking the inhabitants inside, a measure that often led to the slow, agonizing death of entire families rather than containing the disease. Public prayers, fasting, and the burning of strong-smelling substances like pitch or vinegar were common. Desperate attempts to ward off the invisible killer, all based on the erroneous miasma theory. The true vectors, fleas on rats, contaminated water, airborne droplets, remained entirely unknown and therefore unaddressed. Life in Elizabethan London, then, was a constant negotiation with unseen threats and tangible filth. For the ordinary Londoner, survival meant developing a certain stoicism towards pervasive unpleasantness. They learned to step carefully, to hold scented handkerchiefs to their noses, and to simply accept the omnipresence of dirt and disease as an unavoidable part of the urban experience. The ingenuity lay not in grand infrastructure projects, but in the small, everyday strategies individuals adopted to simply get by in a profoundly unsanitary world. As we consider the sheer volume of waste and the constant threat of disease, it begs the question, how did these conditions shape not just the physical health of Londoners, but their very perceptions of public responsibility, community, and the fragile line between life and death? Having navigated the physical realities of waste and pervasive filth in Elizabethan London, it's crucial now to delve into the intellectual landscape that attempted to make sense of it all. How did people conceptualize health and disease when the very air seemed to carry unseen threats, and the ground underfoot was a constant reminder of life's grimy realities? This was an era teetering on the cusp of scientific revolution, yet still deeply rooted in ancient medical theories, religious beliefs, and widespread superstition. The search for cleanliness, therefore, was not a unified scientific endeavor, but a fractured, often contradictory pursuit driven by a mix of fear, tradition, and nascent empirical observation. The dominant medical theory of the age was Galen's humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greece and Rome. This theory posited that the human body was composed of four fundamental fluids, or humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health was believed to be a state of balance among these humors, while illness resulted from an imbalance. External factors like diet, climate, and indeed, the quality of the air were thought to influence this delicate balance. If the air was corrupt or filled with miasmas, noxious vapors arising from decaying organic matter, stagnant water, or even bad smells, it could directly imbalance the humors and lead to sickness. This was why strong perfumes, aromatic herbs, and even the burning of pungent substances were thought to offer protection. They were believed to purify or overwhelm the harmful miasmas. This belief in miasma had some interesting, if largely ineffectual, applications in public policy. Civic authorities, though lacking central organizational power as we understand it, made sporadic attempts to address public health through the lens of scent and visibility. Orders might be issued for streets to be swept, for dunghills to be removed from residential areas, or for butchers to dispose of offal more responsibly. However, enforcement was often lax, and the sheer volume of waste made any sustained effort a Sisyphean task. The motivation was often as much about civic pride and aesthetics, making the city look and smell slightly less appalling, as it was about genuine disease prevention. When a plague outbreak struck, the response was more desperate and fear-driven, with edicts often focusing on quarantines and the movement of infected persons, rather than fundamental improvements to sanitation. Superstition played an equally, if not more, powerful role than embryonic science. In a world where the causes of suffering were often invisible and inexplicable, divine judgment or malevolent supernatural forces provided comforting, if terrifying, explanations. Plagues were frequently interpreted as God's punishment for sin. This belief led to widespread religious observances during epidemics. Days of fasting, public prayers, and processions were common, believed to appease divine wrath. Charms, amulets, and various folk remedies, often based on ancient traditions or anecdotal evidence, were also widely used. Everything from wearing bags of arsenic to carrying specific stones or herbs was thought to ward off disease. These practices, while without scientific basis, provided psychological comfort and a sense of agency in a world where true medical solutions were few and far between. The role of animals in public health was another complex issue. While pigs and dogs were permitted to scavenge in the streets, inadvertently performing a crude form of waste disposal, they also contributed to the spread of disease. Rats, of course, were ubiquitous, thriving in the conditions of filth and carrying the fleas that transmitted bubonic plague. Yet, the connection between rats, fleas, and plague was entirely unknown. People might attempt to kill rats out of a general dislike or for their destructive habits, but not because they were understood as vectors of fatal illness. The domestic cat, often seen as a witch's familiar during this period, was sometimes viewed with suspicion, and their numbers occasionally culled, inadvertently allowing rat populations to flourish. Personal hygiene, as discussed with Queen Elizabeth, reflected these broader perceptions. The infrequency of full-body bathing wasn't just about logistical difficulty. It was also influenced by the belief that water could open pores and allow bad air into the body. Instead, dry cleaning, through repeated changes of linen shifts and the liberal use of perfumes and aromatic oils, became the accepted methods of maintaining a respectable appearance and, by extension, a perceived state of health. To smell clean was to be clean, at least in the eyes of society. Against this backdrop of humoral theory, miasma, and superstition, pockets of nascent empiricism began to emerge. Individuals like John Gerard, a herbalist, and physicians like Thomas Linacre began to meticulously document plants and medical conditions, moving away from purely theoretical approaches. However, these were isolated efforts, not yet coalescing into a coherent, widespread scientific revolution in public health. The scale of the problem was simply too vast, the understanding too limited, and the resources for systemic change virtually non-existent. So, in an environment where genuine understanding of pathology was absent, how did the constant presence of illness and the prevailing beliefs about its causes affect the psychological well-being of the average Londoner? And what coping mechanisms did they develop beyond the purely physical, the pervasive filth, and the rudimentary understanding of public health in Elizabethan London were not merely unfortunate facts of daily life. They were powerful, unseen forces that shaped the very fabric of society, dictating demographics, influencing economic activity, and even fostering a unique kind of social cohesion and resilience. The unintended consequences of poor sanitation extended far beyond individual discomfort, carving deep grooves into the collective experience of a bustling, ambitious nation. One of the most devastating and direct consequences was the relentless demographic impact. The high mortality rates, particularly among infants and children, were a direct result of contaminated water supplies, poor waste disposal, and the constant presence of infectious diseases. A significant portion of the population would not live past childhood, and those who did faced a constant gauntlet of illnesses. This meant that the average life expectancy was dramatically lower than today, and London's population growth was heavily reliant on continuous migration from the countryside. Without this influx, the city would have struggled to maintain its numbers, let alone expand. The sheer number of funerals, a common sight and sound, served as a constant, grim reminder of life's fragility and the omnipresent threat of disease. This constant struggle for survival against invisible enemies fostered a stoicism, a grim acceptance of fate that permeated the cultural consciousness. Death was not a distant, abstract concept, but a familiar neighbor. Economically, the conditions of Elizabethan London presented both obstacles and perverse opportunities. The periodic outbreaks of plague and other diseases could bring trade and commerce to a grinding halt, emptying the streets and shuttering businesses. Fear would grip the city, and those who could afford it would flee to the countryside, taking their wealth and their custom with them. This created economic instability and significant losses. However, paradoxically, The very presence of waste also fueled certain industries. The gong farmers and scavengers, though low in social standing, performed an indispensable service, literally moving mountains of waste. Industries like tanning, brewing, and dyeing, which generated significant amounts of pungent waste products, clustered near rivers or outside city walls, adapting to the environmental realities even as they contributed to them. The need for fresh water and the difficulty of its procurement also stimulated small-scale enterprises focused on water delivery or the sale of ale, which was often safer to drink than the contaminated water. Socially, the conditions of filth highlighted and reinforced existing hierarchies, while also forging unexpected bonds. The wealthy, like Queen Elizabeth, could afford better provisions for cleanliness, more frequent changes of linen, access to purer water from wells outside the most polluted areas, and the use of expensive perfumes to mask odors. They could also escape the city during outbreaks. The poor, however, were trapped, living in crowded tenements, often sharing water sources and privies. They bore the brunt of every epidemic. Their sheer numbers and close proximity made them exceptionally vulnerable. Yet, this shared vulnerability could also foster community. Neighbors relied on each other in times of sickness, sharing remedies, offering comfort, and helping with basic needs when official aid was scarce or non-existent. The resilience of the human spirit, its capacity to find humor, camaraderie, and beauty amidst squalor, is a powerful, if often unacknowledged, aspect of this historical period. The lack of effective sanitation also had a profound impact on diet and food preservation. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant battle. This led to reliance on heavily salted meats, preserved vegetables, and bread as staples. The preparation of food in homes, often exposed to flies and contaminated water, contributed to the spread of foodborne illnesses. The public markets, though bustling centers of commerce, were also hotbeds of potential contamination, with fresh produce and meats often laid out directly on dirty surfaces. The very act of eating was a daily risk, a testament to the fact that survival in Elizabethan London required a strong constitution and perhaps a healthy dose of luck. Perhaps one of the most significant, though long-term, unintended consequences was the gradual, incremental pressure these conditions placed on the developing scientific mind. While humoral theory and miasma persisted, the sheer, undeniable reality of recurring plagues and widespread illness eventually began to chip away at these outdated explanations. The constant observation of patterns, how disease spread more rapidly in crowded, filthy areas, how certain seasons brought more illness, slowly laid the groundwork for future medical breakthroughs. It was a slow, agonizing process, but the very challenges of Elizabethan sanitation, the sheer scale of the problem, created a compelling, albeit tragic, laboratory for understanding the relationship between environment and health. The legacy of Elizabethan London's unseen filth, therefore, is not just a tale of historical unpleasantness. It is a profound illustration of human adaptation in the face of immense environmental adversity. It highlights the stark realities of life before modern science and infrastructure, reminding us of the immense value we place on public health today. It shows how fundamental biological processes, unmanaged, can shape entire civilizations. The bustling, vibrant city that produced Shakespeare and propelled England onto the world stage, did so while grappling daily with conditions that would be unimaginable in our modern metropolises. And so, as we leave the grimy streets of Elizabethan London, reflecting on the constant battle against filth and disease that define daily existence, we are left to ponder, how did these deeply ingrained societal challenges and the lessons learned from survival ultimately influence future generations, setting the stage for the public health revolutions that would eventually transform urban life centuries later? A royal pain, dentistry, and the dread of Elizabethan dental care. Having explored the broader canvas of personal hygiene and urban sanitation in Elizabethan England, we now zoom in on a very specific, yet profoundly impactful, aspect of daily life that often remains hidden behind the grand narratives of political intrigue and military campaigns. The state of dental health for Elizabeth I and her contemporaries, particularly the wealthy. Dental pain was not a rare inconvenience, but a pervasive, debilitating reality, a constant companion that gnawed at their comfort, impacted their appearance, and even affected their ability to speak and eat. This was a direct, often agonizing, consequence of a rapidly changing diet, limited medical understanding, and virtually non-existent preventative care. Imagine, if you will, the daily agony, a dull throb, a sharp jab, a persistent ache that radiated from your jaw, making every bite of food an act of courage, every cold draft a jolt of exquisite pain. This was the lived experience for countless Elizabethans, and notably for the Queen herself. The culprit, surprisingly, was not merely a lack of brushing, but the burgeoning popularity of a newly accessible luxury, sugar. Prior to the Elizabethan era, sugar was a rare and extremely expensive commodity, primarily used for medicinal purposes or as a highly prized status symbol, consumed sparingly by only the wealthiest elite. However, with the expansion of trade routes and the establishment of sugar plantations in the New World, sugar became increasingly available, though still costly, to the burgeoning middle and upper classes. Elizabeth I, like many of her contemporaries who could afford it, developed a considerable fondness for sweet treats. Sugar was incorporated into a vast array of foods, from elaborate confectionery known as sugared subtleties at banquets, to sweetened wines, candied fruits, and even savory dishes where sugar was used as a spice or preservative. The Queen's royal table would have groaned under the weight of such delicacies, and her personal diet likely included a significant amount of this new, delightful, yet devastating ingredient. The irony, of course, was that this symbol of wealth and sophistication was simultaneously a slow poison for her teeth. Without any knowledge of bacteria's role in tooth decay or the concept of regular, effective brushing, the impact of this increased sugar consumption was immediate and widespread. Sugar, as we now know, provides a feast for the bacteria in the mouth, which then produce acids that erode tooth enamel, leading to cavities. These cavities, if left untreated, would deepen, exposing the sensitive dentin and eventually the nerve, leading to excruciating pain, infection, and eventually tooth loss. For Elizabethans, this process was largely unmitigated. Toothbrushes, as we know them, were not invented until centuries later, and while some might use a chew stick, a rough cloth, or a sponge with powdered charcoal or herbs to clean their teeth, These methods were largely ineffective against the onslaught of sugar-fueled decay. The Queen's dental woes became legendary and a matter of public record, often noted by foreign ambassadors who observed her appearance. As she aged, her teeth began to blacken, rot, and fall out, a common affliction among the wealthy who could afford sugar. This wasn't merely an aesthetic issue, it profoundly impacted her ability to eat solid foods, making meals a challenge. More significantly, it affected her speech. Contemporary accounts suggest that her once clear and resonant voice became increasingly difficult to understand as gaps appeared in her smile. Foreign envoys sometimes struggled to comprehend her words, necessitating repetition or closer attention. This was a considerable impediment for a monarch who relied heavily on her oratorical skills to command, persuade, and connect with her subjects and courtiers. The pursuit of pain. Relief in such circumstances was often desperate and rudimentary. Without modern painkillers or anesthetics, the options were limited. Opium, in various forms, might have been available to the very wealthy, offering some temporary solace. Herbal remedies, passed down through generations, were also widely employed. Though their efficacy against severe dental pain was questionable, purgatives, bloodletting, and other traditional medical treatments based on the humoral theory might also be prescribed, under the mistaken belief that dental issues were a symptom of a systemic imbalance in the body rather than a localized infection. These treatments often added to the patient's misery without addressing the root cause. When the pain became unbearable, extraction was often the only recourse. This was a terrifying prospect. There were no dental schools or specialized dentists in the modern sense. Tooth extraction was typically performed by barber-surgeons, blacksmiths, or even unqualified itinerant tooth drawers. Their tools were crude: pliers, forceps, or pelicans, a type of instrument designed to pry out teeth. The procedure was excruciatingly painful, performed without anesthesia, save for perhaps alcohol or an opium tincture, and carried significant risks of infection, broken jaws, or damage to adjacent teeth. Imagine the fear, the sheer terror of lying back while a burly, unwashed individual with rusty tools approached your throbbing tooth. The psychological toll of such experiences, alongside the constant physical discomfort, is difficult for us to fully grasp. The plight of Elizabeth I, despite her regal power, underscored the universal vulnerability to bodily ailments in an age without advanced medicine. Her black teeth were a visible testament to the era's limitations, a silent symbol of the high price paid for sweet indulgence. Considering the widespread prevalence of dental pain and the brutal methods of its relief, how did such chronic discomfort influence the daily lives, social interactions, and even the psychological state of Elizabethans, particularly those of high standing who were expected to maintain a facade of perfection? Having established the pervasive problem of tooth decay, fueled by the burgeoning sugar trade and the Queen's own painful experience, we now turn our attention to the individuals who attempted to alleviate this suffering and the surprisingly diverse, often perilous, landscape of Tudor oral hygiene practices. This was a world where professional specialization in medicine was still rudimentary, and the line between skilled practitioner and outright charlatan was often blurred, particularly when it came to the agony of a rotten tooth. The primary figures entrusted with bodily ailments, including dental ones, were often the barber-surgeons. These individuals, as their title suggests, combined the humble trade of haircutting and shaving with more invasive medical procedures like bloodletting, wound dressing, and, critically, tooth extraction. Their training was largely apprenticeship-based, learning through observation and practice rather than formal anatomical study or specialized dental education. They operated with a limited understanding of infection, sterilization, or even basic anatomy beyond the most superficial level. Their tools, often crude and unsterilized, were designed for force rather than precision. Various pliers, forceps, and a feared instrument known as the pelican, which resembled a crane's beak and was notorious for dislodging not just the offending tooth, but often adjacent healthy ones, or even fracturing the jaw. For the most part, a visit to a barber surgeon for a tooth extraction was a last resort, undertaken only when the pain became unbearable or infection threatened life. Imagine the scene: a dimly lit room, perhaps in the back of a barber's shop, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and perhaps a faint tang of blood. The patient, held down by assistants, bracing themselves against unimaginable pain. There was no local anesthetic beyond perhaps a swig of strong ale or a rub of opium tincture, which might dull the senses but certainly wouldn't eliminate the agony of a tooth being wrenched from its socket. The cries of patients were a common sound in such establishments, a grim testament to the brutality of the procedure. Post-extraction, infection was a constant threat, as open wounds were highly susceptible in an age without antibiotics or understanding of germ theory. Many would succumb to fever or other complications from an infected socket. Beyond the barber surgeons, the field of dental care was also populated by a colorful array of quacks and itinerant tooth drawers who traveled the country, setting up stalls at fairs and markets. These individuals often employed theatrical displays and grand pronouncements to attract customers, promising instant relief. Their methods were often even cruder and more dangerous than those of the barber surgeons. Some might use instruments that were little more than modified blacksmith's tools, while others resorted to bizarre concoctions or magical incantations, all promising to draw out the worm believed to cause toothache. The success rate was low, and the risk of permanent damage or severe infection was exceedingly high. Yet, for those without access to more established practitioners or driven to desperation by incessant pain, these quacks offered a glimmer of hope. However false, the concept of preventative oral hygiene, as we understand it, was virtually non-existent. There was no widespread understanding of the need for daily brushing or flossing to remove plaque and food particles. As noted earlier, while some might use rough cloths, sponges, or even their fingers to rub their teeth, these efforts were minimal and ineffective against the corrosive power of sugar. Various powders and rinses were concocted, often made from abrasive substances like crushed brick or charcoal, or from acidic compounds like vinegar, which could actually do more harm than good to enamel over time. Herbal rinses, often containing sage, mint, or rosemary, were used more for their aromatic properties and perceived medicinal benefits than for genuine cleaning. The focus was on masking bad breath, a common affliction given the state of oral health, rather than addressing the underlying causes of decay. For the elite, including Elizabeth. Toothpicks made of silver, gold, or quill were common accessories, used to dislodge food particles after meals. While a minor aid, they were hardly a comprehensive solution. The Queen's own practice, as foreign observers noted, was to perhaps rinse her mouth with wine or other concoctions, and occasionally rub her gums with a cloth. But the fundamental problem of sugar-induced decay remained. Her personal pain was a testament to the limitations of even the most privileged medical care of the age. The cultural acceptance of poor dental health was also striking. Blackened or missing teeth were common, particularly among older individuals and the wealthy. While not considered beautiful by modern standards, they were not necessarily seen as a mark of shame. In fact, for the rich, blackened teeth could even be a subtle sign of prosperity, indicating one could afford the expensive sugar that caused the decay. This speaks to a vastly different aesthetic and a societal adaptation to prevailing conditions. The world of Tudor oral hygiene was, therefore, a stark reflection of its medical knowledge and technological capabilities. It was a realm where pain was commonplace, solutions were brutal, and prevention was a concept barely conceived. This reality profoundly impacted the daily lives of everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the most powerful monarch. Considering this landscape of limited knowledge and painful interventions, how did the chronic, often debilitating, dental suffering endured by Elizabethans subtly, yet significantly, influence their cultural narratives, their artistic expressions, and perhaps even their psychological endurance in a challenging world? The relentless ache of a decaying tooth, the constant threat of infection, and the sheer brutality of extraction methods were not mere footnotes in the grand tapestry of Elizabethan life. They were fundamental elements of the human experience that transcended social strata, impacting everyone from the lowliest pauper to the most powerful monarch. The story of dental health, or rather the lack thereof, in Tudor England reveals a silent suffering that profoundly influenced daily routines, social interactions, and even the public image of figures like Elizabeth I, leaving a legacy that resonates in unexpected ways even today. For Elizabeth I, the progressive deterioration of her teeth was a particularly cruel affliction, a constant reminder of physical vulnerability despite her immense political power. As discussed, her love for sugar, a symbol of her wealth and status, came at a steep price. Contemporary accounts often remarked on her blackened teeth, a detail that stood in stark contrast to the porcelain white smiles idealized in modern portraiture. This wasn't merely a cosmetic concern. It deeply affected her quality of life. Eating became a painful ordeal, limiting her dietary choices and likely contributing to overall discomfort during meals. More critically, as gaps appeared in her teeth, her once powerful and resonant voice, a key tool of her governance and charisma, became increasingly muffled and difficult to understand. Imagine a queen, renowned for her eloquent speeches and sharp wit, struggling to articulate her commands, her words occasionally lost in the gaps of her decaying smile. This must have been a source of immense personal frustration and a challenge to her regal authority, forcing her to perhaps speak more slowly or rely more heavily on written communication and the interpretations of her trusted advisors. The silent suffering extended to the self-consciousness of a public figure expected to embody perfection. Even if that perfection was increasingly elusive, in the face of bodily decay. Beyond the physical and practical implications, the prevalence of poor dental health undoubtedly had a significant psychological impact. Chronic pain, particularly when it affects the mouth and face, is notoriously debilitating. It saps energy, diminishes mood, and can make even simple tasks feel arduous. For a monarch like Elizabeth, whose role demanded constant mental acuity and emotional resilience, persistent dental pain must have been an insidious burden, perhaps contributing to the periodic irritability or weariness noted by her courtiers. It underscores the profound physical endurance required to govern in an age without even basic pain management beyond crude opiates or alcohol. The ability to push through such constant discomfort to maintain a facade of strength and composure speaks volumes about her fortitude. The social ramifications of dental issues also extended beyond the individual. Bad breath, a natural consequence of decaying teeth and poor oral hygiene, was widespread, while likely tolerated due to its ubiquity. It would have subtly influenced social interactions, making close conversations less pleasant. The use of pomanders and strong perfumes, as we discussed, was not just about masking body odor, but also about mitigating the unpleasantness of breath. The sight of missing or blackened teeth was so common that it likely normalized the condition, though undoubtedly those with better teeth, perhaps due to natural resistance to decay, or simply less access to sugar, would have stood out. Ironically, as sugar became more accessible, the visible signs of its consumption, decaying teeth, became almost a badge of honor for the wealthy, a bizarre testament to their affluence. The Elizabethan era's struggles with dental health serve as a powerful historical mirror, reflecting not just medical limitations, but broader societal values. The focus on pain relief through extraction rather than prevention highlights a reactive approach to health, driven by immediate suffering rather than long-term well-being. This was a world where medicine was often about managing symptoms, sometimes brutally, rather than curing causes. The value placed on appearances, even if cosmetically achieved through makeup and wigs, demonstrates a human desire to project an ideal regardless of underlying realities. Crucially, the legacy of this royal pain and the widespread dental agony of the era eventually contributed, albeit slowly and indirectly, to future advancements. The sheer scale of suffering, the clear link between diet sugar and decay observed over generations, and the inadequacy of existing treatments created a fertile ground for eventual innovation. While it would take centuries, the continuous human struggle against toothache eventually spurred the development of specialized dentistry, improved tools, and, critically, a scientific understanding of oral hygiene and prevention. The collective memory of this pervasive pain, passed down through generations, became an implicit driver for change. So, when you consider the regal portraits of Elizabeth I, with her serene expression and elaborate attire, try to superimpose the silent suffering of her dental reality. Her reign, marked by triumph and intrigue, was also a testament to her profound physical endurance in an age where even the simplest of bodily comforts could not be guaranteed. The story of Elizabethan dental hygiene is a humble yet potent reminder of how much our modern lives are shaped by advancements that, for centuries, were beyond the wildest dreams of even the most powerful monarchs. The art of disguise. Cosmetics and Fashion in the Age of Odor. Having delved into the realities of Elizabethan personal hygiene and the widespread dental woes, we now turn our gaze to another fascinating, yet equally perilous, aspect of appearance in the 16th century: the elaborate world of cosmetics. For Queen Elizabeth I and the aristocratic women, and indeed some men of her court, makeup was not merely an aesthetic choice. It was a potent tool of disguise, a declaration of status, and a crucial component in presenting an idealized image of beauty and health in an era where genuine cleanliness was a constant challenge. However, the pursuit of this ideal often came at a horrifying cost, involving the application of toxic substances that slowly poisoned the wearer. Imagine the stark contrast between the dull, grimy backdrop of Elizabethan London and the luminous, almost ethereal faces of its elite. The prevailing beauty standard was a complexion of porcelain white skin, often with a hint of rosy cheeks, framed by a high forehead and thin, arched eyebrows. This look was not naturally achievable for most, especially given the outdoor life and rudimentary skincare of the era. Instead, it was meticulously constructed using a range of often dangerous ingredients, applied with a dedication that bordered on ritual. The cornerstone of this desired paleness was a cosmetic known as ceruse. This was a white lead-based paint derived from a toxic compound of white lead and vinegar, applied thickly to the face, neck, and décolletage. Ceruse created the desired pallor, effectively covering blemishes, smallpox scars which Elizabeth herself had, and the ruddy complexions that often resulted from outdoor exposure, while effective in creating the desired visual effect. Ceruse was highly poisonous. Lead, when absorbed through the skin, accumulates in the body, leading to a host of debilitating symptoms over time. Chronic lead poisoning could cause hair loss, muscle paralysis, skin lesions, severe abdominal pain, cognitive impairment, and eventually organ failure and death. For those who used it regularly, like Elizabeth, the cumulative effects would have been insidious, slowly eroding their health. Yet, despite the observed ill effects, the skin would eventually gray and become damaged, making ever thicker applications necessary. The fashion persisted. The allure of the ideal image outweighed the observable health risks, largely because the connection between the cosmetic and the illness was not understood. Symptoms like fatigue, hair loss, and digestive issues were often attributed to imbalances of humors, divine displeasure, or other causes, rather than the very substances applied to the skin. This ignorance allowed the dangerous cycle to continue, trapping users in a literal slow poison. To complete the desired look, other potentially harmful substances were also employed. Rosy cheeks were achieved with fard, a pigment often made from cochineal, vermilion, which contained mercury sulfide or madder root mixed with oil or grease. Vermilion, like ceruse, introduced another toxic element into the cosmetic routine, while perhaps less readily absorbed than lead. Repeated exposure to mercury could also lead to neurological damage, tremors, and kidney problems. Lips were reddened with similar pigments, or sometimes with beeswax tinted with cochineal. Eyebrows were often plucked to achieve a high, arched line, or drawn on with coal or burnt cork. Hair was styled elaborately, and for Elizabeth, increasingly covered by wigs, especially after her hair thinned or turned gray. The famous Elizabethan hairline, a high forehead achieved by plucking the hair at the temples, was also part of this aesthetic, creating an elongated, almost intellectual appearance that was highly fashionable. The application of these cosmetics was a daily ritual performed by skilled attendants. For a monarch like Elizabeth, it would have been a prolonged process, transforming her public face into a carefully constructed mask. This mask was not merely about hiding imperfections. It was about projecting an image of ageless beauty, health, and purity, a stark contrast to the underlying physical realities of chronic dental pain, occasional skin eruptions, and the unseen toll of lead and mercury. The whiteness of the face, in particular, symbolized purity, virginity, a key aspect of Elizabeth's political image, and aristocratic status, as only those who did not toil in the sun could maintain such a pallor. However, the consequences of this cosmetic regimen were deeply etched onto the Queen's own body. Her skin, beneath the ceruse, eventually suffered. Accounts suggest it became discolored and damaged, necessitating ever thicker layers of makeup. The hair loss, fatigue, and other ailments she experienced in her later years could, at least in part, be attributed to chronic lead poisoning, slowly accumulating in her system. The very tools of her visual power were simultaneously undermining her health. So, as we consider this perilous artistry of Elizabethan makeup, creating a beautiful yet toxic veneer, what fundamental tension did this practice expose between the outward projection of power and beauty and the inner, unseen realities of health and vulnerability in the Tudor court? Having explored the dangerous artistry of Elizabethan cosmetics, which transformed the face into a canvas of idealized, yet toxic, beauty, we now shift our focus to another critical element of appearance in the 16th century: clothing. Beyond its obvious function of modesty and decoration, Elizabethan fashion, particularly for the elite, served a far more practical and often overlooked purpose. Layers of linen, silk, velvet, and brocade acted as a complex system of barriers, physical, social, and even olfactory, protecting the wearer from the elements, from the curious gaze of society, and perhaps most importantly, from the pervasive unpleasantries of a world largely devoid of modern sanitation. Imagine the sheer volume and weight of a full Elizabethan ensemble for a noblewoman, or, indeed, the Queen herself. It was not a simple dress and a few accessories. It was a meticulously constructed edifice of fabric, often comprising a linen shift worn directly against the skin, followed by a kirtle or petticoat, a farthingale, a hoop skirt, or padded roll to create volume, a stiffened corset or bodice, and finally, the elaborate gown itself, often with puffed sleeves, a high-standing ruff, and an intricate embroidery. Over this, one might add an open gown or an overskirt. For men, layers included shirts, doublets, hose, and elaborate cloaks. Each layer served a purpose, both aesthetic and practical. The innermost layer, the linen shift or smock, was arguably the most crucial from a hygiene perspective. As discussed in Elizabeth's personal regimen, these linen garments were the closest thing to daily clean clothing. Linen is a natural fiber, absorbent and relatively easy to wash. Worn directly against the skin, the shift absorbed sweat, body oils, and dead skin cells, acting as a protective barrier for the more expensive and difficult to clean outer garments. While a full bath was rare, changing one's linen shift daily or every few days provided a rudimentary form of freshness. The shift, being made of a durable and washable material, could be boiled, scrubbed, and bleached, enduring repeated vigorous washings that would destroy delicate silks or velvets. This simple garment was the unsung hero of Elizabethan cleanliness, allowing the wearer to feel, if not truly clean, then at least less soiled. The layers beyond the linen shift served multiple purposes. The corset or bodice, often made from stiffened canvas or leather, provided the desired silhouette, cinching the waist and pushing up the bust. This rigid foundation was not merely about fashion, it also enforced a particular posture, conveying an air of aristocratic poise and control. The farthingale, which gave skirts their enormous, impressive volume, created a personal space, a literal barrier between the wearer and the crowded, often unhygienic, world around them. In a dense court or a bustling street, this physical expanse could provide a degree of separation from jostling bodies and potential sources of contagion. However minor, the outer garments, the gowns, doublets, and cloaks were a lavish display of wealth and status, made from imported silks, velvets, brocades woven with gold and silver thread, and adorned with pearls, jewels, and intricate embroidery. These were extraordinarily expensive and precious items. Their very value dictated that they were rarely, if ever, washed. Immersion in water would ruin their delicate fabrics, dyes, and embellishments. Instead, these garments were aired out, brushed vigorously to remove dust and loose dirt, and perhaps lightly scented with perfumes or hung near aromatic herbs to dispel unpleasant odors. Imagine the lingering smells trapped within these rich fabrics over weeks, even months, of wear. The layers, therefore, also functioned as a barrier to contain the body's natural odors, preventing them from permeating the expensive outer garments, and conversely, keeping the external world's smells at bay. The infamous ruff, a starched and pleated collar, often made of fine linen or lace, also played a role beyond mere fashion. Positioned high around the neck, it physically separated the face from the body, perhaps offering a slight psychological barrier against the more immediate emanations of body odor. It also framed the face, drawing attention to the carefully constructed cosmetic appearance, further emphasizing the visual over the olfactory. Beyond individual garments, the sheer act of being heavily clothed acted as a significant barrier against the physical environment. The roads were muddy and often covered in animal waste. The air was thick with smoke and dust. Multiple layers of fabric provided an insulation against the cold and damp, protection against splashes and grime, and a buffer against the myriad insects that thrived in the unsanitary conditions. To be fully dressed in Elizabethan fashion was to be encased, almost cocooned, from the less desirable realities of the outside world. Yet, this elaborate system of layers, while offering protection and projecting status, also had its own drawbacks. The weight and bulk of the clothing could be restrictive and uncomfortable, particularly in warmer weather. The difficulty of changing and cleaning these garments meant that, while a fresh linen shift offered temporary relief, the outer layers accumulated their own unique patina of human and environmental scent over time. So, as we observe the meticulously constructed sartorial splendor of the Elizabethan elite, a complex interplay of fabric, form, and function. What further insights does this layering reveal about the ingenious, if often indirect, ways in which people adapted their everyday lives to manage discomfort and project an idealized image in a world constantly challenging their senses? We have journeyed through the perilous application of toxic cosmetics and the intricate layering of Elizabethan fashion, revealing how both served as sophisticated tools of disguise. Now, we arrive at the culmination of this exploration, the deceptive allure, how this elaborate construction of appearance functioned not just to enhance beauty or project status, but to actively mask the harsh realities of Elizabethan hygiene, creating an ideal image that stood in stark contrast to the pervasive dirt and odors of the era. This masking act was not merely aesthetic, it was deeply intertwined with social expectations, political power, and the very concept of identity in a world where visible and olfactory signals conveyed profound meaning. The Elizabethan court was a stage, and its inhabitants, particularly the Queen, were its principal players. Every element of their attire and presentation was a meticulously crafted costume, designed to convey specific messages about wealth, power, virtue, and desirability. The porcelain white face, achieved with ceruse and other pigments, spoke volumes about leisure and nobility, a life lived indoors, away from the sun's tanning rays, untainted by manual labor. It was an aesthetic ideal that implicitly denied the grimy realities of city life and the pervasive odors that accompanied them. The ruff, framing the face, drew attention upwards, away from the body, emphasizing the regal countenance over any underlying imperfections or emanations. The stiff, voluminous gowns, particularly with the farthingale, created a physical bubble around the wearer, a visual and tactile declaration of personal space that belied the crowded, often tactile, nature of life in close quarters. These were not just clothes, they were social armor, insulating the wearer from an often unpleasant physical reality. The sheer opulence of the outer garments, with their rich fabrics, intricate embroidery, and glittering jewels, served as a powerful distraction. The eye was drawn to the shimmering silks, the gleaming pearls, the exquisite craftsmanship, rather than dwelling on the less glamorous aspects of cleanliness. This visual spectacle was so overwhelming that it could, for a time, make one forget the underlying truths of infrequent bathing, decaying teeth, and ambient stench. The illusion was paramount. This was particularly true for Elizabeth herself, whose image was carefully curated to project an image of purity, strength, and ageless beauty, an image essential for maintaining her authority as a female monarch in a male-dominated world. Her painted face and elaborate gowns were not just personal preferences, they were instruments of statecraft, reinforcing her mystique and divine right. However, the deception was ultimately a fragile one. While cosmetics and fashion could mask the immediate visual and olfactory signs of poor hygiene, they could not prevent the long-term consequences. The lead and mercury in the makeup slowly poisoned the wearer, leading to skin damage, hair loss, and systemic health problems, turning the very tools of beauty into agents of decay. The elaborate gowns, rarely washed, would accumulate their own complex aromas over time, a subtle counterpoint to the applied perfumes. The limitations of internal hygiene, such as decaying teeth and digestive issues, would eventually betray the outward perfection, as seen with Elizabeth's own dental woes impacting her speech. The body, ultimately, asserts its realities. Yet, the persistence of these practices, despite their drawbacks, reveals a profound insight into human adaptability and the power of social convention. People of the Elizabethan era operated within a different sensory paradigm. Their noses were accustomed to a wider range of odors, their eyes to a greater spectrum of appearances. What we perceive as utterly repugnant, they perhaps registered as commonplace. The deceptive allure worked because it aligned with their expectations of what power and beauty should look like and smell like. Given the limitations of their technology and understanding, it was a collective agreement to value the appearance of cleanliness and health over its complete physical attainment. The legacy of Elizabethan cosmetics and fashion, therefore, is not just about historical trends. It's about the enduring human desire for control over appearance, for the ability to project an ideal self, even in the face of harsh realities. It serves as a stark reminder of how far medical and hygienic understanding has come, freeing us from the perilous choices that Elizabethans faced between beauty and health. It also highlights the timeless human need for social signaling through appearance, a need that continues to drive fashion and beauty industries today, albeit with vastly different scientific underpinnings. And so, as we consider the elaborate, often dangerous, lengths to which Elizabethans went to craft their appearance, masking the realities of their physical world, we are left to ponder what fundamental truths about human vanity, resilience, and the power of perception does this historical paradox reveal? And how do these echoes of disguise continue to manifest in our modern pursuit of an idealized self? The privies of power, waste disposal in royal palaces and beyond. Having explored the individual's attempts at managing cleanliness through personal hygiene, dental care, and cosmetic disguise, we now descend into perhaps the most fundamental and universally challenging aspect of daily life in Elizabethan England: the disposal of human waste. This is not a topic often covered in romanticized historical accounts, yet it was a constant, pervasive reality that dictated architectural design, influenced social order, and presented an unending logistical nightmare in a world without flushing toilets or complex sewage systems. The management of human excrement was a gritty, smelly, and absolutely essential endeavor, handled through a variety of ingenious, if often primitive, methods. Imagine a grand royal palace like Whitehall or Hampton Court. You might picture soaring ceilings, tapestries, and richly dressed courtiers, but beneath the veneer of opulence lay a very different reality, dictated by the immutable biological needs of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of residents and visitors. The primary method of waste disposal within these grand structures was the garde-robe. The word itself, derived from French, literally means wardrobe, hinting at its initial dual purpose as a place where clothes were hung, the ammonia fumes from the urine supposedly deterring fleas and other vermin. In practice, a garde-robe was essentially a privy chamber, a small room or alcove with a hole in the seat, often cantilevered out from the side of the building. The waste would drop directly into a cesspit below, or, in some cases, directly into a moat or a river. While seemingly a practical solution, garde-robes were far from clean or efficient. The pits beneath them were, by their nature, overflowing with human waste, creating a concentrated source of foul odors that permeated the surrounding areas of the palace. Despite being located in specific towers or isolated sections of the building, the pervasive stench would inevitably waft through windows, up stairwells, and into nearby rooms, reminding everyone of their presence. For the royal family and high-ranking courtiers, garderobes were typically located for convenience, sometimes even directly off their bedchambers, illustrating how closely intertwined the realities of waste were with the very spaces of power. The act of relieving oneself was not a private, odorless affair, but a public, odorous one, with the sounds and smells carrying through the thin walls. For those without access to a garderobe, which was most people, alternative methods prevailed. Chamber pots were ubiquitous. These ceramic or pewter vessels were used day and night within private rooms. Their contents would then be emptied, either into a larger communal cesspit directly into the street, or, for the more fastidious or perhaps those under strict orders, into a designated midden or refuse heap. The casual emptying of chamber pots out of windows onto the street below was a common, if highly unpleasant, practice, contributing significantly to the pervasive filth of urban centers. The cry of garde-à-l'eau, from the French garde à l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, was allegedly uttered in some crowded cities to warn passers-by of an impending shower of human waste. Communal cesspits were often shared by multiple households, sometimes mere holes in the ground, covered by a flimsy wooden structure. These would fill rapidly, requiring frequent emptying. This is where the gong farmers entered the scene, a profession previously mentioned, but worth revisiting in detail for the sheer unpleasantness of their task. The word gong likely comes from the Anglo-Saxon word for privy or dung. These were the individuals tasked with manually emptying cesspits and privies, a job so repulsive and ill-smelling that they were often legally mandated to work only at night, primarily between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., to avoid public outcry and to minimize the spread of the unbearable stench. They were also forbidden from reselling the night soil, human excrement, within the city limits. The tools of a gong farmer were simple: shovels, buckets, and perhaps a lantern. They would descend into the pits, often waist deep in excrement, shoveling it into barrels or carts. The work was not only disgusting, but also dangerous. The decomposition of human waste produces methane and other toxic gases, making suffocation or explosion a real threat in poorly ventilated pits. Despite the risks and the social stigma, gong farmers provided an absolutely essential service, without which cities would have rapidly become uninhabitable. Their existence underscores the fundamental challenge of sanitation in a pre-industrial world, where biological processes dictated daily life with unyielding force. Beyond human waste, animal waste was another massive contributor to the overall problem. Horses, indispensable for transport and labor, left copious amounts of manure on the streets. Livestock kept within city limits for food or trade added to the problem. This animal waste, combined with household refuse and industrial effluent, created the complex, layered odor of Elizabethan London we discussed earlier. The lack of proper drainage systems meant that rain often merely redistributed this waste, rather than washing it away effectively. The Thames River, London's lifeblood, served as the ultimate, albeit utterly contaminated, recipient of much of this waste. Privies often emptied directly into it. Cesspits seeped into its groundwater, and carts dumped their contents along its banks. The river, which was also a source of drinking water for many, a major fishing ground, and a crucial transportation artery, became a literal open sewer, a testament to the limited understanding of environmental hygiene and the overwhelming challenge of managing waste for a rapidly growing urban population. The consequences of this were dire, directly contributing to the devastating outbreaks of waterborne diseases like dysentery and typhus. So, as we observe the relentless, inescapable challenge of waste disposal in Elizabethan England, from the royal guardrobes to the perilous work of the gong farmers, we are left to ponder, how did the constant presence and visibility of human and animal waste subtly, yet profoundly, influence the psychological landscape of daily life, impacting attitudes towards cleanliness, health, and social order itself? Having explored the foundational methods of waste disposal, from the omnipresent chamber pot to the thankless task of the gong farmer, we now pivot to a more specific and perhaps more surprising aspect of Elizabethan sanitation: the systems, or lack thereof, within the very heart of power, the royal palaces. While one might assume that the residences of a monarch like Elizabeth I would boast significantly advanced hygienic solutions, the reality was often a compromise between grandeur and the brute facts of pre-modern engineering. The royal flush was, for the most part, an elaborate, manual, and an often inefficient process, constantly battling the sheer volume of human waste generated by a bustling court. The principal royal palaces, such as Whitehall, Hampton Court, and Nonsuch, were not merely residences, they were centers of government, places where hundreds, sometimes thousands, of courtiers, servants, foreign dignitaries, and petitioners gathered daily. This meant that the logistical challenge of waste management was amplified exponentially compared to a private household. While garderobes were common features, their design and emptying required continuous labor and planning. In many multi-story buildings, the waste from garderobes would simply drop through a shaft into a deep pit or fosse at the base of the building. These pits, effectively enormous cesspools, would accumulate waste for extended periods, sometimes for years, before they were finally emptied. The longer the accumulation, the more potent and pervasive the stench. The location of these guardrobe shafts was often strategically chosen, typically in external walls or turrets, to allow for easier access for emptying and to mitigate the direct spread of odors into living quarters. However, even with careful placement, the pervasive smell was often inescapable, particularly on warm days or when the wind blew in a particular direction. The very structure of the palaces, with their thick stone walls and lack of modern ventilation, meant that once odors seeped in, they tended to linger, becoming part of the ambient atmosphere. Imagine walking through a grand corridor, admiring a tapestry, and suddenly being assailed by a wave of foul air emanating from a nearby guardrobe tower. This was a common experience for courtiers. Beyond the fixed guardrobes, royal palaces also made extensive use of portable close stools or privy chairs. These were essentially commodes, often beautifully crafted from wood, with an upholstered seat covering a removable chamber pot. For the queen and high-ranking nobles, these would be placed directly in their private bedchambers or nearby antechambers. offering a greater degree of privacy and convenience than a shared garderobe. Attendants, usually pages or grooms of the stool, a highly intimate and trusted position, were responsible for emptying these pots multiple times a day. The contents would then be carried to larger communal cesspits, or perhaps directly into the river if the palace was situated along one. This manual labor, often carried out by junior servants, was a constant, unseen ballet of waste removal, crucial to maintaining any semblance of order within the royal household. The challenge of water supply also played a significant role in limiting sanitation advancements. While some royal palaces, like Hampton Court, had sophisticated conduit systems bringing fresh spring water from miles away, this water was primarily for drinking, cooking, and occasional washing, not for flushing waste. The sheer volume of water required for a flushing system, combined with the difficulty of heating and moving it, made such technology impractical on a large scale. Furthermore, the concept of a closed sewage system, where waste was carried away underground to a distant treatment plant, was centuries beyond Elizabethan engineering capabilities. The flush as we know it, invented by Sir John Harington, Elizabeth I's godson, in 1596, was a curious novelty, a single prototype installed at his home and another for the Queen, but it required an immense amount of water and was not widely adopted due to these logistical challenges. It was a brilliant but premature invention. The management of waste within the royal precincts also extended to other forms of refuse. Kitchen waste, animal offal from slaughterhouses that served the royal table, and general refuse from hundreds of people would be collected and deposited in designated dung heaps or pits within the palace grounds. These attracted rats, flies, and other vermin, contributing to the overall unsanitary environment and posing a constant health risk. While efforts were made to keep these areas at a distance from the main living quarters, the pervasive odors and the sheer scale of waste often made it an uphill battle. The very design of Elizabethan palaces, therefore, was a constant negotiation with biological reality. Architects had to consider not just grandeur and defense, but also the practicalities of waste removal for an ever-present crowd. The unseen networks of garderobe shafts, the daily journeys of chamber pot contents, and the labor of the gong farmers were all integral, if unglamorous, parts of the royal machine. The illusion of royal splendor often masked a core of fundamental, smelly problems that no amount of gold or velvet could truly conceal. Considering the constant, demanding effort required to manage waste within these centers of power, how did the physical limitations and perpetual struggle with sanitation subtly shape the daily routines, power dynamics, and even the sense of privacy among the elite within Elizabeth's court? Having peered into the specific, often unsavory, details of waste disposal within Elizabethan royal palaces, we now draw back to consider the broader implications, the constant struggle with human and animal refuse, the limitations of technology, and the very visible reality of filth did more than just create an unpleasant sensory environment. They fundamentally defined daily life, reinforced social hierarchies, and subtly shaped the perception of order and power in Tudor society. The lingering stench was not just a physical reality, but a metaphor for the pervasive challenges that underpinned the era's grand narratives. The most immediate and pervasive impact of rudimentary waste management was on the sensory experience of life. Imagine a world where foul odors were not the exception, but the norm. The human nose, confronted daily with a cacophony of smells from open sewers, rotting refuse, and unwashed bodies, would have adapted, becoming less sensitive to what we would now consider overwhelmingly offensive. This desensitization was a crucial coping mechanism, allowing people to function in an environment that would render a modern person nauseated and distressed. Yet, the omnipresence of these smells still acted as a constant, if background, reminder of the precariousness of existence. The close proximity to decay and disease, the very air you breathed carried the undeniable truth of a world grappling with its own biological output. Social stratification was starkly highlighted by the differences in waste management. While the royal family and high nobility had access to guardrobes, close stools, and diligent attendants, their cleanliness was still relative. They might escape the direct stench of the street, but the underlying systems were still primitive. For the vast majority of the population, particularly the urban poor, conditions were far worse. They lived in crowded tenements with shared, overflowing privies, or simply used chamber pots emptied directly into the gutters. Their homes might share walls with refuse heaps, and their water sources were often contaminated by runoff from these very heaps. This disparity in environmental quality reinforced social divisions. The ability to mitigate filth, even slightly, was a clear marker of wealth and status. The common saying, "Cleanliness is next to godliness," began to emerge, but for most, godliness in this context was an unattainable luxury. The logistical challenge of waste management also influenced urban planning and the flow of daily life. Certain areas, particularly those downwind of tanneries, slaughterhouses, or large communal cesspits, would be less desirable for residents. The movement of gong farmers at night, the occasional overflowing of a cesspit, or the casual emptying of a chamber pot from an upstairs window were all events that shaped pedestrian traffic and public behavior. It created a society where caution and a certain resignation to unpleasantness were necessary virtues. The development of markets, streets, and even palace layouts had to implicitly factor in the realities of where waste would be generated and how it would be or wouldn't be removed. Furthermore, the lack of effective waste disposal directly contributed to the relentless cycles of disease that plagued Elizabethan England. The interconnectedness of contaminated water, insect vectors like flies attracted to refuse, and the lack of basic hygiene created a perfect storm for epidemics. While people didn't understand germ theory, they certainly observed the correlation between foulness and sickness, fueling the miasma theory. This collective experience of vulnerability, shared by rich and poor alike, though the poor suffered disproportionately, fostered a unique cultural approach to health and death. Fatalism was common, and religious piety often increased during outbreaks, as people sought divine intervention in the face of an invisible, seemingly unstoppable enemy. The attempts to manage waste, however primitive, also demonstrate a subtle, emergent understanding of human impact on the environment, even if not articulated in modern terms. The designation of dumping grounds outside city walls, the regulations for gong farmers, and the occasional civic efforts to clean streets all point to an implicit recognition that unchecked waste was detrimental to public welfare. if only for its smell and visible unpleasantness. These rudimentary efforts were the distant ancestors of modern sanitation departments and public health initiatives, born out of necessity and the overwhelming challenge of keeping human settlements viable. The legacy of Elizabethan waste management is, therefore, a powerful reminder of the profound impact of basic infrastructure on human civilization. It underscores how much our modern comfort and health are built upon systems that were unimaginable to even the most powerful people of the 16th century. The constant, lingering stench of Elizabethan England, far from being a mere historical curiosity, was a defining characteristic of daily life, shaping social order, influencing health outcomes, and reminding everyone, from queen to commoner, of the ever-present, humble realities of the human body. Medical maladies and miasma, the connection between sickness and smell. Having navigated the tangible realities of Elizabethan hygiene, from personal regimens and dental woes to the vast problem of waste disposal, we now turn to the intellectual framework through which people attempted to understand the very source of illness. In an age devoid of microscopes and germ theory, the prevailing explanation for disease transmission was rooted in a concept as ancient as it was pervasive: the theory of miasma. This belief, while ultimately incorrect in its scientific detail, profoundly shaped medical practice, public health efforts, and the daily anxieties of Elizabethans, connecting sickness directly to the unseen, yet powerfully felt, presence of bad air or noxious smells. Imagine yourself as an Elizabethan physician, a learned man, or occasionally woman steeped in classical texts and traditional wisdom. You observe an outbreak of plague or a wave of dysentery sweeping through a crowded neighborhood. You see people sicken and die, but you cannot see the microscopic pathogens at work. What do you conclude? Drawing from the works of Hippocrates and Galen, revised and reinterpreted over centuries, the most logical explanation seemed to be that disease was caused by miasma, a Greek word meaning pollution or bad air. This wasn't merely a quaint notion, it was the dominant scientific paradigm, informing every aspect of diagnosis and treatment. Miasmas were believed to emanate from decaying organic matter, rotting corpses, stagnant swamps, open sewers, putrefying refuse heaps, and even the unwashed bodies of the sick. This bad air was thought to carry a corrupting influence, a poisonous vapor that, when inhaled, disrupted the delicate balance of the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An imbalance in these humors is, as we've discussed, the direct cause of illness. Therefore, if you could eliminate the miasma or protect yourself from its influence, you could prevent disease. The logic, within its own framework, was compelling, even if the premise was flawed. This theory permeated daily life. People believed that certain locations were inherently unhealthy because of their bad air. Low-lying, marshy areas were considered particularly dangerous, as they were prone to stagnation and decay. Overcrowded urban centers, with their open sewers and accumulated waste, were also seen as breeding grounds for miasmas. This explained why plagues often began in the poorer, denser districts before spreading outwards. The very smell of decay, putrefaction, and human waste was not just offensive, it was perceived as a direct indicator of disease-causing miasma. To smell something foul was to smell potential death. Physicians and ordinary people alike adopted various strategies to combat miasma. One common practice was to burn aromatic substances. Imagine walking into a sick room and finding bowls of burning frankincense, myrrh, or sulfur, or observing people burning pitch in the streets during a plague. These strong-smelling fumes were believed to purify the air, driving out the noxious miasma and replacing it with more wholesome, pleasant scents. While we now know this did nothing to kill bacteria or viruses, it provided a sense of agency and psychological comfort, a visible and tangible effort to fight an invisible enemy. The personal carrying of pomanders, those small, often ornate balls filled with musk, ambergris, or perfumed herbs, was another direct application of miasma theory. Held to the nose, they offered a personal shield against the corrupt air encountered in crowded streets, public gatherings, or sick rooms. For the wealthy, these were not merely fashion accessories, they were vital pieces of protective equipment, believed to filter or overpower the dangerous fumes. The queen herself and her courtiers would have regularly employed such devices, a testament to their deep-seated belief in the power of scent to ward off illness. Medical treatments were also heavily influenced by miasma theory. If illness was caused by an imbalance of humors due to bad air, then treatments focused on restoring that balance. This often involved bloodletting to remove excess blood, purging to expel bile, or the use of emetics to induce vomiting, all aimed at ridding the body of harmful substances or rebalancing the humors. While these treatments sometimes led to a temporary feeling of relief, they often weakened the patient and did little to combat the actual infectious agent. Doctors might also prescribe a change of air, advising patients to move to the countryside or to a place with cleaner air, a practice that, by removing them from sources of infection, sometimes had an unintended positive effect. Despite its scientific inaccuracies, the miasma theory did lead to some practices that, by sheer coincidence, had marginal benefits. For instance, the general desire to remove obvious sources of stench, such as overflowing dunghills or animal carcasses from the streets, did reduce the breeding grounds for rats and flies, which were true vectors of disease, even if the connection wasn't understood. The push for basic sanitation, though driven by a misunderstanding of contagion, sometimes inadvertently improved public health. However, the fundamental flaw of miasma theory was its inability to explain why some people got sick and others didn't, or why diseases spread through specific modes of transmission like touch or contaminated water. This led to a constant cycle of fear, misdiagnosis, and ineffective interventions, leaving Elizabethan society perpetually vulnerable to epidemics. Considering the widespread adherence to miasma theory and its tangible impact on daily practices, how did this particular understanding of disease transmission shape Elizabethan attitudes towards the sick, inform their preventative measures, and influence the broader social response during times of epidemic crisis? Building upon our understanding of miasma theory, the belief that bad air caused disease, we now delve deeper into the practical, everyday strategies Elizabethans employed to protect themselves from these invisible threats. This was a battle fought not with scientific remedies, but with an arsenal of scents, from fragrant herbs and spices to elaborate pomanders and strong-smelling concoctions. These aromatic defenses were more than just pleasant additions. They were seen as vital protective measures, a tangible way to fight back against the unseen forces of contagion that permeated the air. Imagine the pungent, yet perhaps oddly comforting, smell of rosemary, rue, or lavender in an Elizabethan household, not merely as decorative potpourri, but as a deliberate shield against illness. These, and many other aromatic plants, were widely used for their perceived medicinal properties. Sprigs of herbs might be scattered on floors, particularly in public spaces or sick rooms, to be trodden underfoot, releasing their protective essences. Herbal strewing was a common practice in palaces, churches, and private homes, aiming to purify the air and mask less desirable odors. For instance, rue, with its strong, somewhat bitter scent, was often associated with warding off evil and infection, and might be found in courtrooms or prisons. Beyond general strewing, specific preparations were made to harness the power of these scents. Sweet bags or nosegays were small pouches filled with dried, fragrant herbs, often carried in the hand or tucked into clothing. These personal air purifiers could be brought to the nose when encountering particularly offensive smells, a common occurrence in any Elizabethan town, or when passing by sick individuals. For those of higher status, these might be exquisitely embroidered, a subtle blend of practical protection and fashionable accessory. The very act of holding a sweet-smelling object to one's nose offered a psychological barrier, a sense of control in a world where true control over disease was elusive. The pomander, as mentioned previously, was the apex of this aromatic defense, often an intricately crafted piece of jewelry made of silver or gold, sometimes shaped like an apple or an orange. It contained compartments for various potent aromatic substances. These substances, musk, ambergris, civet, frankincense, myrrh, camphor, and combinations of powdered herbs and spices like cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg, were chosen not just for their pleasantness, but for their strength. The more powerful the scent, the more effective it was believed to be at dispelling miasma. A nobleman might have a pomander hanging from his belt. A lady might carry one in her hand, both constantly prepared to raise it to their nostrils whenever the air grew suspect. This wasn't merely a status symbol, it was a deeply ingrained form of personal protective equipment. However flawed its scientific premise, beyond personal use, broader attempts were made to purify the air in public spaces, particularly during outbreaks of plague or other epidemics. Civic authorities might order the burning of pitch, tar, or even gunpowder in the streets, believing the acrid smoke would scour the air of its corrupting influences. Churches might burn incense more frequently, and sick rooms were often filled with the smoke from burning herbs or vinegar-soaked cloths. While these actions had no effect on microorganisms, they created a visual and olfactory spectacle that affirmed society's collective struggle against disease, providing a tangible, albeit symbolic, response to an invisible threat. The concept of bad air also influenced medical advice for those who could afford it. Physicians might recommend that patients move to the countryside or to a higher elevation where the air was perceived to be purer and less prone to the accumulation of miasmas. This practice, while based on a flawed theory, sometimes inadvertently helped patients by removing them from crowded, unsanitary urban environments, thereby reducing their exposure to actual pathogens. The idea of fresh air as beneficial even if for the wrong reasons, slowly gained traction. Even the architecture of houses was subtly influenced by the concern over bad air. While comprehensive ventilation systems were non-existent, attempts might be made to air out rooms by opening windows, especially during daylight hours, despite the concern that direct drafts could also cause illness. Chimneys, primarily for heating, also served to draw some of the stale air and odors out of a room, offering a minor, unintentional benefit to air quality. Despite the pervasive use of these aromatic defenses, the cycles of disease continued unabated. The recurring outbreaks of plague, smallpox, and other illnesses served as grim reminders that the miasma theory, while offering a logical framework, was fundamentally incomplete. No amount of sweet-smelling herbs or potent perfumes could halt the spread of bacterial or viral infections. The inability of these methods to truly combat disease left Elizabethans in a constant state of vulnerability, oscillating between hopeful adoption of aromatic remedies and despair when epidemics inevitably returned. So, as we observe the widespread reliance on these aromatic defenses, a testament to both human ingenuity and scientific limitations, what profound psychological effects did this constant, if ultimately futile, battle against unseen bad air have on the daily lives and collective consciousness of Elizabethan society? We have journeyed through the Elizabethan understanding of disease, rooted in the compelling but ultimately flawed miasma theory, and explored the aromatic defenses employed to combat bad air. Now, we arrive at the crucial culmination, the profound impact of the absence of germ theory on Elizabethan health practices and societal responses to illness. The era's medical landscape, from the devastating outbreaks of plague to the insidious spread of poxes, was entirely shaped by this fundamental blind spot, leaving a legacy of valiant but often ineffective struggles against invisible enemies, and paving the way for the revolutionary insights that would transform human health centuries later. The most catastrophic consequence of not understanding germ theory was the inability to effectively combat epidemic diseases. The bubonic plague, or Black Death, remained a terrifying and recurring specter throughout the Elizabethan period, sweeping through towns and cities with terrifying speed and devastating mortality rates, without knowing that the plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily by fleas on rats. All efforts to control its spread were largely futile. Quarantines were enacted, but often too late or inconsistently enforced. Infected houses were boarded up with their occupants inside, leading to agonizing deaths. Large public gatherings were sometimes banned, and markets might close, but the underlying mechanisms of transmission continued unchecked. The constant fear of plague cast a long shadow over daily life, shaping migration patterns, economic activity, and even religious fervor. Every suspicious lump, every fever, became a potential harbinger of doom. Similarly, diseases like smallpox, which Elizabeth herself contracted and survived, though marked by scars she concealed with cosmetics, and various forms of typhus and dysentery, ravaged the population. These too were viral and bacterial infections, spread through direct contact, contaminated food and water, or insect vectors, none of which were understood. Smallpox inoculation, a rudimentary form of vaccination, would only emerge in a few isolated pockets much later, and widespread vaccination against such diseases was centuries away. Doctors and healers, armed only with their humoral theories and miasma beliefs, resorted to treatments like bloodletting, purging, and the application of various poultices, which often weakened the patient further or introduced new infections. Rather than targeting the specific pathogens, the sheer randomness of survival or death, as perceived by Elizabethans, often led to interpretations based on divine favor or punishment rather than biological cause. The lack of germ theory also meant that even well-intentioned hygiene practices were often ineffective or misplaced, while the impulse to clean up visible filth and mask offensive odors through strewing herbs, burning aromatics, or carrying pomanders was driven by the miasma theory. It did not directly address the microscopic sources of disease. A beautiful, fragrant palace could still be a breeding ground for rats carrying plague-infected fleas, or harbor contaminated water supplies. The emphasis on airing out rooms was beneficial, but without understanding airborne transmission of specific pathogens, it was a shot in the dark. The constant battle against bad air was a brave but ultimately losing fight against an enemy whose true nature was entirely misunderstood. This fundamental scientific blind spot had profound implications for social attitudes towards the sick and the dying. Illness was often viewed with suspicion, sometimes seen as a punishment for sin, leading to stigmatization and fear of contagion. The healthy often ostracized the sick, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, understandable fear for their own survival. This contributed to social fragmentation during epidemics. Despite occasional acts of charity and community support, the public display of disease symptoms, particularly skin lesions from smallpox or venereal diseases, could lead to social ruin, prompting the heavy use of cosmetics to conceal such telltale signs. However, amidst this pervasive ignorance and suffering, the seeds of future scientific inquiry were unknowingly being sown. The diligent record-keeping of births, deaths, and causes of death, however incomplete, provided empirical data that would later be invaluable. The keen observation skills of physicians, even if their conclusions were flawed, contributed to a growing body of clinical knowledge. The very failure of miasma-based interventions to halt epidemics created a persistent intellectual tension, a nagging question that would eventually lead inquiring minds to seek new explanations. The recurring nature of disease, its devastating impact, and the ineffectiveness of existing treatments provided a powerful, if grim, impetus for scientific revolution. The legacy of Elizabethan medical maladies, therefore, is not just a tale of historical hardship. It is a profound testament to the incremental nature of scientific progress. It highlights the vast chasm between earnest effort and effective intervention when fundamental principles are unknown. The suffering endured by Elizabethans, from plague to pox, and their valiant but often misguided efforts to combat it, laid the unseen groundwork for the eventual triumph of germ theory. It was the collective weight of centuries of unexplained illness and ineffective remedies that ultimately propelled humanity towards the microscopic discoveries that would transform public health and grant us a degree of control over disease that was utterly unimaginable to Elizabeth I and her subjects. Their stinking history of disease was a necessary, if painful, chapter in the grand narrative of human survival and scientific enlightenment. This concludes our journey through the stinking history of Elizabethan England, a time when personal hygiene, urban sanitation, and medical understanding were vastly different from our own. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan to some soothing background music, and let's drift off into the quiet contemplation of how far we've come. Remember the subtle sense of ancient palaces, the quiet resilience of those who navigated a world brimming with unseen challenges, and the slow, meandering path of human discovery. Let the echoes of their daily struggles fade into the gentle hum of your fan, carrying you into a peaceful slumber, knowing that even in the most challenging of times, humanity finds a way to endure, adapt, and eventually to illuminate the darkest corners of its own existence. Good night,